You can't have those things here, she declared, her voice a grating symphony of entitlement that scraped across the otherwise tranquil morning air. The woman, whose name I would soon learn was Karen Miller, was pointing a trembling, sausage-like finger at my chicken coop. She stood precisely on the surveyed property line, a plus-sized sentinel of suburbia clad in a violently pink polo shirt stretched to its absolute structural limits. Her posture radiated an authority she did not possess, at least not here, not on my land. I was enjoying my second cup of coffee on the back porch, watching the sun burn the last of the dew from the long grass in my pasture. This porch, this land, was the entire point of my retirement. After 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, designing and overseeing the construction of things far more complex and important than the flimsy tract homes behind her, I had come home to the 120 acres my great-grandfather had bought and farmed. It was a pocket of rolling hills and old-growth timber, bisected by a spring-fed creek, an island of history surrounded by a sea of beige vinyl siding and meticulously manicured lawns that went by the absurdly pretentious name of Whispering Pines Estates. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice level. I did not stand up. That would have been a concession, an acknowledgement that this was a meeting of equals. It was not. She was a trespasser on the border of my sovereign territory. Those things are Gallus domesticus, chickens. Her face, already florid, deepened to a shade of raw beet. I know what they are. They are a violation. They're unsanitary, they're noisy, and they are not in compliance with the Whispering Pines aesthetic covenants. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch. My land, Sterling Farms, was not, and had never been, a part of Whispering Pines. My grandfather had sold the 80 acres that comprised the subdivision to a developer back in the 90s, with clear and legally recorded carve-outs and easements. I was not a resident. I was not a member of her homeowners association. I was the neighboring feudal lord she apparently mistook for a serf. "Ma'am," I said, setting my mug down with a deliberate, soft click. "Your covenants are of no more concern to me than the phases of the moon are to a rock. This is my property. You are standing on the edge of it. I'd advise you not to cross the line." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, a fish gasping for the water of its own self-importance. "This entire area is under the purview of the board. That shack," she gestured at the coop I had built with my own hands from reclaimed barnwood, "is an eyesore. We've had complaints." "From whom? The deer?" "From residents. It lowers property values. We have a standard to maintain. The board has decided that structure must be removed. We're planning a community garden for that space." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it almost made me laugh. Her board, her community garden, on my land. This was not a negotiation. This was a declaration of war. "Let me be exceptionally clear," I said, my voice dropping into the register I used to reserve for contractors who thought they could cut corners on a bridge foundation. "You have no purview, no authority, and no standing here. Your board is a private club that governs that collection of houses." I gestured with my coffee mug toward the subdivision. "It has zero jurisdiction over this farm. Now, I'm going to finish my coffee. I suggest you return to your side of the line before you're cited for trespassing." She puffed herself up, her chest swelling against the strained fabric of her shirt. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers. We will have that blight removed, and you will be billed for it. This is your only warning." She spun around, a maneuver of surprising agility for a woman of her bulk, and marched back toward the nearest cul-de-sac, her arms swinging stiffly at her sides. I watched her go, the quiet rage beginning to smolder in my gut. It was a cold, familiar feeling, not the hot flash of anger, but the slow, deep burn of a problem that needed to be dismantled, piece by piece. She had invaded my peace. She had threatened my property. She had made a critical error. She had mistaken a sleeping dog for a dead one. I finished my coffee. The campaign had begun. 3 days later, the first salvo of the paper assault arrived. It was delivered by a certified mail carrier, requiring my signature, a classic intimidation tactic designed to give the document a weight it did not legally possess. The envelope itself was an object of profound pretension. It was made of a thick, cream-colored cardstock, heavy and unyielding in my hand. In the top left corner, embossed in a gold font that screamed "New Money," was a vaguely fascistic logo of a single, stylized pine tree flanked by what looked like architectural calipers. Underneath it, the words, "Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, Board of Directors." I slit the envelope open with a letter opener my father had used his entire life. Inside, a single sheet of the same heavy bond paper. The text was laid out like a legal summons. It was titled, in bold, capitalized letters, "Final Notice of Covenant Violation and Remediation Order." The document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense. It cited 3 separate sections of the Whispering Pines covenants, which of course did not apply to me. It listed the violations. Section 4.7, Unauthorized Agricultural Structures. Section 5.2, Non-Conforming Outbuildings, and my personal favorite. Section 8.1, Nuisance Abatement, Livestock. It claimed my chicken coop, which was a good 200 yards from the nearest subdivision house, was creating an olfactory disturbance and audible pollution. The notice demanded the immediate removal of the structure and all associated livestock within 14 days. Failure to comply would result in a fine of $100 per day, retroactive to the date of the initial verbal warning, her little tirade at my property line. Furthermore, it stated that if I failed to remediate the violation, the association would contract for the removal and disposal of the offending structure and its contents at the homeowner's expense, with all associated costs placed as a lien against my property. It was signed at the bottom with a flamboyant, aggressive scrawl, "Karen Miller, President, Whispering Pines Estates, HOA." I read the letter twice, a slow, dangerous calm settling over me. This was her strategy: overwhelm and intimidate with official-looking paper, hoping the recipient would be too frightened or too ignorant to question it. It was the weapon of the petty tyrant. But I was not a frightened homeowner worried about the color of my mailbox. I was a retired colonel of engineers who had managed billion-dollar contracts and stared down lawyers from corporate giants. This was not a legal document. It was a bluff, printed on expensive paper. I walked into my study, a room lined with bookshelves holding everything from military history to structural engineering manuals. On the large oak desk, I placed the letter. Then, I went to my supply closet and retrieved a 3-inch D-ring binder. It was black, heavy, and built for serious work. From a box of office supplies, I took out a label maker and a set of tabbed dividers. I typed the first label and affixed it to the spine of the binder. Operation Clucking Thunder. It was a small act of defiance, a touch of the gallows humor that gets you through long deployments. It codified my intent. This was no longer a disagreement. It was an operation. It required intelligence, strategy, and overwhelming force. I punched holes in Karen Miller's ridiculous letter and clipped it into the binder behind the first tab, which I labeled Enemy Communications. This was the first piece of evidence, the opening shot in her campaign against me, and it would be the first exhibit in my counteroffensive. I sat at my desk for a long time, the heavy binder open before me. The quiet life I had planned for myself had been interrupted. The peace I had earned was under siege. But as I looked at that letter, I realized something. I wasn't just angry. A part of me, a part that had been dormant since I took off my uniform, was awake. The engineer, the logistician, the strategist, Karen Miller wanted a war. I was going to give her one she would never forget. The first phase of any campaign is reconnaissance. You don't engage the enemy until you know their strength, their disposition, and most importantly, the terrain. In this case, the terrain was not soil and rock, but bylaws and county records. The enemy's field manual was their own book of rules. A quick search online yielded the public documents for the Whispering Pines Estates, HOA. I downloaded the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and Rs, and printed the entire 80-page document. I spent the next 2 days in my study with a pot of coffee, a red pen, and a set of highlighters. It was like dissecting an enemy's order of battle. The language was deliberately obtuse, a tangled web of legalese designed to be impenetrable to the average person. But I wasn't the average person. I was trained to read dense, technical specifications. I found what I expected: broad, sweeping grants of power to the board, vague definitions of nuisance and aesthetic harmony, and a complex system of fines and enforcement actions. But I also found their weaknesses. Procedural requirements the board had to follow, specific timelines for notifications, rules for calling special meetings. I highlighted every instance where the board was constrained by its own rules. This was ammunition. But the real intelligence lay deeper. The foundation of this entire conflict was jurisdiction. Karen Miller's entire case rested on the faulty premise that her authority extended to my land. I needed to prove, with unimpeachable documentation, that it did not. That meant a trip to the county seat. The County Records Building was a depressing concrete edifice from the 1970s that smelled of stale air and slowly decaying paper. I navigated my way to the property appraiser's office and then to the archives, a quiet, climate-controlled room where the history of the county was stored on microfilm and in massive leather-bound plat books. I started with the deed for my own property, tracing it back through my father, my grandfather, to my great-grandfather. It was a solid, unbroken chain of title. Sterling Farms was clearly and legally defined. Then I pulled the records for the development of Whispering Pines Estates. It took me 3 hours of scrolling through microfilm, but then I found it. The master deed from 1994, when my grandfather sold the acreage to the developer. And there, on page 12, was the key to the entire kingdom. It was a section titled Easements and Special Covenants. It explicitly stated that the property known as Sterling Farms was exempt from any and all current or future covenants of the Whispering Pines development. But there was more. I scanned down the page, my eyes catching a paragraph that made me sit bolt upright in my chair. It detailed a water use easement. When the developers had planned the subdivision, they realized the municipal water main was on the far side of their new property and running a dedicated line for the common areas, the sprinkler system for the grand entrance, the clubhouse, and the community pool would be prohibitively expensive. My grandfather's farm, however, had a powerful spring-fed well and its own 2-inch water main that ran along the border of the property they had just purchased. So they struck a deal. My grandfather granted the developer, and by extension their successor HOA, the right to tap into his water main to service their common areas. In exchange, the HOA was to pay a nominal fee of $500 a year for maintenance, and most critically, the easement agreement stated that the connection point, including the master valve and the water meter, was located squarely on Sterling Farms property, my property. The valve that controlled the water to their manicured entrance, their pristine pool, and the lush grass around their clubhouse was under my sole and absolute control. I printed a dozen copies of that page, the ink from the old microfilm reader smelling of ozone and victory. This was not just a shield, it was a sword. It was leverage of the highest order. My next stop was to establish contact with a higher authority, an outside agency that superseded the ridiculous power of an HOA board. The letter mentioned my chickens and the spring-fed creek that ran behind the coop. Karen had unknowingly given me another avenue of attack. Back in my study, I made a call to the state's Department of Environmental Protection. I got a bored-sounding caseworker on the line and calmly explained the situation. I was a landowner with a natural spring and a federally protected waterway on my property. A neighboring homeowners association was demanding I remove a small agricultural structure, citing aesthetic concerns, and had vaguely threatened action that could impact the land around the creek. The caseworker's tone shifted instantly from bureaucratic apathy to sharp-edged interest. He asked me to repeat the name of the HOA. He asked for my parcel number. I could hear him typing furiously. "Sir," he said after a moment, "Black Creek, which is what your spring feeds into, is a protected waterway. Any alteration to the land within 50 feet of its bank, any construction, demolition, or even significant landscaping requires a permit from this office. Is this HOA threatening to perform such work without a permit? They have stated in writing their intent to hire a contractor to remove and dispose of a structure on my land, which is well within that 50-foot boundary," I said, quoting directly from Karen's letter. There was a pause. "Would you be willing to forward a copy of that written notice to me?" he asked, his voice now laced with a kind of bureaucratic glee. "I think we'll need to open a file and send a courtesy letter to this Mrs. Miller, reminding her of the state statutes regarding protected waterways and the rather substantial penalties for violating them." I had my higher authority. I had found the federal law that trumped the local ordinance. The final piece of the reconnaissance phase was to build a resistance. A tyrant is only strong as long as their subjects are afraid and isolated. I suspected Karen Miller had been ruling Whispering Pines through fear for some time. I needed to find her other victims. I needed to build a coalition. I started my insurgency campaign that afternoon. I put on a work coat and drove my pickup truck to the edge of my property, where I began ostentatiously mending the fence that ran along the subdivision's backyards. It wasn't long before I had my first contact. An elderly woman, her back bent with age but her eyes sharp, came out of her house to tend her rose bushes. She kept glancing over at me. I gave her a friendly wave. "Hello there," I said. "Just making sure the fence is sound. I'm John Sterling." "I know who you are," she said, her voice a soft whisper. She looked nervously back toward the other houses. "I'm Eleanor Gable. Lived here 20 years. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Gable." She lowered her voice even more. "I saw that woman yelling at you the other day. The president." She said the word president like it was a disease. "You want to be careful with her. She's a nasty piece of work." "I'm beginning to get that impression," I said. "She seems to have an issue with my chickens." Mrs. Gable gave a sad little smile. "Last month, It was my garden gnome. She said it violated the allowable statuary clause. Fined me $50. My late husband gave me that gnome. Bingo. The first victim ally. That seems unreasonable, I said, my voice full of sympathy. That's just the start of it, she said, emboldened. The Martinezes, 3 doors down, a young family. She's fining them $75 a month because their son's basketball hoop is visible from the street. They can't afford to fight it. I spent another hour working on the fence. I met the Martinezes. They were a young couple, exhausted and stressed. They confirmed Mrs. Gable's story. They told me about others, a family fined for having their trash cans out 2 hours too early. A man ordered to repaint his front door because the shade of blue was not on the approved palette. Another resident hit with a bill for a tree on their own property that the HOA had decided to cut down without their permission. It was a clear pattern of abuse, a reign of petty tyranny built on small, relentless acts of intimidation. Each resident was too isolated and too afraid of legal fees to fight back on their own. But they weren't on their own anymore. I took down their names, their stories, and copies of their violation notices. Each one was a data point, another page for my binder, which was growing thicker by the day. I now had enemy communications, terrain analysis, legal precedents, a powerful outside agency on alert, and the beginnings of a local insurgency. The seeds of rebellion had been planted. Now it was time to bring in the professional reinforcements. Phase 3 of the operation required a specialist. While I was confident in my research and my position, a campaign of this nature needed to be fought on all fronts. Karen Miller had threatened me with lawyers. It was time to deploy my own. I wasn't looking for just any lawyer. I needed a specific weapon for a specific fight. I needed a JAG officer. After a few calls to old contacts from my service days, I got a name: David Chen. He was a retired Marine Corps lawyer, a former judge advocate general, who had opened a private practice specializing in real estate and contract law, with a particular and very profitable focus on HOA disputes. His office was in a sleek, modern building downtown, a world away from the dusty records office and the manicured conformity of Whispering Pines. David Chen was sharp, energetic, and had the piercing, no-nonsense gaze of a man who had cross-examined liars for a living. We shook hands, and I took the seat opposite his large, uncluttered desk. "Colonel Sterling," he said with a nod of respect. "Good to meet you. My father was Army 1st Cavalry. He told me to never trust an engineer with a map, but always trust one with a plan. What's the situation?" I didn't waste his time with a long, emotional story. Instead, I lifted the heavy 3-inch binder from my briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of his desk. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud. "To an Operation Clucking Thunder," I said, without a hint of a smile. Chen raised an eyebrow, but a flicker of amusement crossed his face. He opened the binder. For the next 20 minutes, he said nothing. He simply turned the pages, his eyes scanning the documents with practiced speed. He saw the initial letter from Karen, my printed copy of the HOA covenants with my detailed annotations, the high-resolution copies of the county plat maps, and the highlighted damning page from the original deed detailing the water easement. He read the summary of my call with the Department of Environmental Protection and the list of other victimized residents with copies of their bogus violation notices. When he finally looked up, he had a slow, dangerous grin on his face. "Colonel," he said, tapping a finger on the binder, "this isn't a case. This is a kill box. You've done 90% of my work for me. This is the most thorough piece of opposition research I've ever seen from a civilian." "I'm not a civilian," I corrected him gently. I'm retired. Touché, he laughed. So what's the objective? Do you want to just get them to back off? Or do you want to dismantle them? This isn't about my chickens anymore, Mr. Chen, I said. This is about restoring order. The woman in charge, Karen Miller, is a petty tyrant who has been abusing her power and bleeding the residents of that community dry. The objective is to remove her and the entire complicit board from power, nullify every fine they've levied in the last year, and return the governance of that neighborhood to the residents themselves. David Chen leaned back in his chair, his grin widening. I like your style, Colonel. Scorched earth. Okay. Here's our strategy. We don't fire a warning shot. We fire a 155mm high explosive round right into their command bunker. He outlined the plan. The first step was a legal counter-salvo, a formal response to their notice. It wouldn't be a simple denial. It would be an overwhelming show of force, designed to stun and disorient them. It would cite the specific state statutes they were violating. It would reference the active DEP case file and the potential for six-figure fines for environmental damage. It would assert my absolute rights under the recorded deed, and most importantly, it would put Karen Miller and each board member on notice that if they proceeded, we would not only sue the HOA as an entity, but we would sue them personally for tortious interference, harassment, and conspiracy to commit trespass. Continued. We're going to pierce the corporate veil, Chen explained. An HOA board is generally protected from personal liability, but that protection vanishes when they knowingly and repeatedly act outside the scope of their authority. Your binder proves they've been put on notice. If they take one more step, they're walking into a minefield, and they'll be paying for it out of their own pockets. The strategy was brilliant. It wasn't just defensive, it was offensive. It shifted the field of battle from her turf to mine, and it placed the financial risk squarely on Karen's shoulders. What do you think she'll do? I asked. People like this, these little power-hungry despots, they have one of two reactions to a show of force like this, Chen said. They either collapse immediately, terrified of the consequences, or they double down, convinced of their own righteousness. Given your initial assessment of her personality, I'm betting on the latter. And that's what we want, I said, understanding the strategy perfectly. Exactly, Chen confirmed. We want her to make a mistake. We want her to escalate. We've laid the trap. Now we let her walk right into it. Every step she takes from now on will just dig her hole deeper. I hired him on the spot. He spent the next day drafting the letter. It was a thing of beauty. 10 pages of dense, precise, and utterly terrifying legal prose. It was a declaration that they had picked a fight with a force they could not comprehend. He sent it via courier to the HOA's management company and via registered mail to Karen Miller's personal address. The counter-salvo had been fired. The enemy had been engaged. Now we waited for their next move, confident that their arrogance would be their undoing. The binder on my desk felt heavier now, not with evidence but with potential energy, a coiled spring waiting for the perfect moment to be released. The enemy's response came a week later, and it was exactly what David Chen had predicted. A person driven by logic or reason would have retreated. A person motivated by ego, however, sees a challenge not as a warning, but as an insult. Karen Miller was deeply motivated by ego. She didn't respond with a letter from her lawyer. That would have been a sign of a tactical pause, a reassessment of the battlefield. Instead, she escalated. She ignored our legal broadside entirely and opted for direct action. It was a foolish, arrogant blunder, and it was the beginning of her end. I received a new piece of certified mail. It wasn't a legal response. It was a summons. I was being called to a disciplinary hearing before the Whispering Pines Architectural Review Committee. The charge was failure to remediate a persistent covenant violation. The notice stated that my attendance was mandatory and that if I failed to appear, a judgment would be entered against me in absentia, authorizing the immediate removal of my chicken coop. It was a show trial, a piece of political theater designed to project an image of power and process where none existed. I scanned the document and immediately forwarded it to David Chen. His emailed response was succinct. Perfect. She's creating an official record of her own malfeasance. We'll attend, but we won't be on trial. But Karen's hubris didn't stop there. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, she made her most critical mistake. I was in my workshop, sharpening a set of chisels, when I heard the rumble of a heavy truck coming up my long gravel driveway. I walked outside to see a large flatbed truck with a small backhoe on it, followed by a pickup from a local company called Evergreen Landscaping. 2 men in dusty work clothes got out and looked uncertainly at my house, then at a work order in their hands. I walked calmly toward them, my demeanor placid, but my mind already documenting every detail of the encounter. I had my phone in my pocket, its video recorder already running. "Help you, gentlemen?" I asked. The older of the two, a man with a deeply tanned face and the weary eyes of someone who deals with difficult customers for a living, consulted his clipboard. "We're here for a demolition and removal job. Address is 141 Sterling Road. Order from the Whispering Pines HOA. Says to take down a wooden shed in the back pasture." "That would be my chicken coop," I said, my voice dangerously pleasant. "And you're on my property. Did the person who hired you, a woman named Karen Miller, happen to tell you that this is private land and not part of the HOA?" The man frowned. "No, sir. She just said it was a community standards enforcement action." "I see," I said. "Well, let me clarify the situation for you. You are currently trespassing. The structure you've been hired to demolish is my private property. If you so much as scratch the paint on your backhoe, you and your company will be named in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for destruction of property, conspiracy, and illegal trespass. Furthermore, that structure is within a protected environmental zone, and I have an active case file with the state DEP. Any work you perform here will subject your company to fines that will likely bankrupt it." The 2 men exchanged a nervous look. The foreman's face paled under his tan. "I am now handing you a formal notice of this," I continued, pulling a folded document from my back pocket. It was a letter David Chen had prepared for precisely this contingency. A cease and desist notice addressed to any and all contractors or agents. It cited the relevant property laws and the DEP statutes. This document makes you a knowing participant in an illegal act if you proceed. You will not be able to claim you were just following orders. You will be held personally and corporately liable. The foreman took the paper as if it were a live snake. He read the first paragraph, his eyes widening. "She told us it was all cleared," he muttered, more to his partner than to me. "She said the homeowner was non-compliant and this was the final step." "She lied," I stated simply. "And she tried to make you her criminal instrument. I'd advise you to pack up your equipment and have a very serious conversation with her about the fraudulent contract she hired you under. I am recording this entire conversation, by the way." I held up my phone so they could see the red recording dot. That was the final straw. The foreman threw the clipboard onto the passenger seat of his truck. "Nope, not happening," We're not getting dragged into this mess. Sorry to bother you, sir. They scrambled back into their trucks and retreated down my driveway in a cloud of dust and humiliation. I stopped the recording. I now had video evidence of Karen Miller attempting to use a third party to illegally enter my land and destroy my property. It was a beautiful, unforced error. She was walking deeper and deeper into the kill box. The final piece of the puzzle, the smoking gun, arrived that very evening. I got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was quiet, nervous, and belonged to a man. "Is this Colonel Sterling?" he asked. "It is. My name is Arthur Pinter. I'm the treasurer of the Whispering Pines HOA. His voice was shaking. "I can't talk long. She watches everything, but what she's doing to you, it's not right. It's not the first time. I have to do something." I listened patiently as Arthur poured out his story. He was a retired accountant who had taken the treasurer position, thinking it would be a quiet way to serve his community. Instead, he found himself a reluctant accomplice to Karen's reign. He told me she ran the board like a personal fiefdom, intimidating the other members into unanimous agreement. He told me the HOA's lawyer was a personal friend of hers, who rubber-stamped her decisions without doing any real due diligence. "There are things in the financials, things that aren't right," Arthur whispered. "Contracts for landscaping and pool maintenance going to her brother-in-law's company for twice the market rate. A beautification fund with no receipts. Special assessments for legal contingencies that just disappear. I can't be a part of it anymore. I'm afraid of what she'll do, but I'm more afraid of being implicated when this all blows up." "What do you want to do, Mr. Pinter?" I asked. "Can you meet me? In an hour? At the public library downtown? I have copies of everything. The ledgers, the invoices, the bank statements for the last 3 years." He was my inside source, the defector from the enemy camp bearing the keys to the kingdom. An hour later, in a quiet corner of the library's history section, a pale, sweating Arthur Pinter slipped a small USB flash drive into my hand. "I'm resigning tomorrow," he said. "Good luck." And then he was gone. I went straight home. I plugged the drive into my computer. It contained a meticulously organized set of files, spreadsheets, scanned invoices, bank records. It took me less than an hour to find what I was looking for. The corruption was blatant. The self-dealing was obvious. The beautification fund was a slush fund Karen Miller used for personal expenses, disguised as community projects. She was using the residents' money to fund her petty tyranny and her lifestyle. This was the kill shot. I now had her on jurisdictional violations, environmental law violations, harassment, attempted destruction of property, and now, finally, embezzlement and fraud. The show trial she had scheduled was no longer just a hearing about my chicken coop. It was about to become her court-martial. The night of the disciplinary hearing arrived. The battleground was the clubhouse at Whispering Pines, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the nearby pool and desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly, unflattering glare on the proceedings. The room was packed. Word had spread. The confrontation with the landscaping crew, my quiet conversations with the other residents, and the sudden resignation of the treasurer had created a buzz. This was no longer just about my chickens. This was about the future of the community. I saw Mrs. Gable in the front row, and the Martinezes near the back, holding their young son. They were my troops, my resistance cell, ready for the signal. David Chen and I arrived a few minutes early. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. I was in a simple blazer and slacks. We were calm, prepared. We were not the ones on trial. At the front of the room was a long folding table draped with a cheap polyester cloth. In the center sat Karen Miller, looking smug and imperious in an aggressive navy blue blazer with a gaudy gold pin of the HOA's pine tree logo on the lapel. She was flanked by two other board members, a man and a woman who both looked deeply uncomfortable, like hostages trying to project an air of normalcy. Karen banged a small, toy-like gavel on the table. "This special hearing of the Architectural Review Committee is now in session," she announced, her voice echoing slightly in the tense room. "The matter before the committee is the persistent and egregious covenant violation at 141 Sterling Road." She looked directly at me, a triumphant sneer on her face. "Mr. Sterling, you have been summoned to answer for your refusal to comply with the association's directives. How do you plead?" David Chen stood up slowly. "With all due respect, Madam President," his voice was calm but carried to every corner of the room, "my client is not here to plead. We are here to inform you that this hearing is an illegal assembly, that you and this board are acting far outside your legal authority, and to put you on notice of pending legal action for damages." A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face tightened. "This is our hearing, Mr. Chen. You will speak when spoken to. Now, Mr. Sterling." "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I stood up next to David. "He's right. This is not your hearing. You have no authority over me or my property. You never have. But since you've gathered all these good people here tonight, I think it's a perfect opportunity to discuss some things that are actually relevant to the residents of Whispering Pines." David Chen nodded to me. It was time to execute the plan. Phase 1, I thought. "For weeks," I began, addressing the room, not the board, "your HOA president has been harassing me, sending threatening letters, and even attempting to hire contractors to illegally enter my private property and destroy a structure." "Lies!" Karen shrieked, banging her toy gavel. "You are in violation." "Am I?" I asked calmly. I turned to David, who opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. He handed one to each of the board members, who took them with trembling hands. "This is a copy of the original deed for this development. I'd like to draw your attention to page 12, section 4, which explicitly exempts my property from any and all of your covenants. Your entire case against me is based on a fiction. You have been wasting association funds chasing a ghost." I let that sink in. The residents were looking at each other, whispering. "But this isn't just about me," I continued, raising my voice slightly. "This campaign of harassment is a pattern for Mrs. Miller. It's a pattern of abuse against anyone who doesn't bow to her absolute control." "Mrs. Gable." On cue, Eleanor Gable stood up. Her voice was frail, but it was clear and steady. "She fined me $50 for a garden gnome my dead husband gave me. She called it unapproved statuary." "The Martinezes," I called out. Mr. Martinez stood, his wife holding his arm for support. "She's been fining us $75 a month for a basketball hoop. Our son's basketball hoop. We were told if we fought it, she'd bury us in legal fees." One by one, a half-dozen other residents stood and told their stories. The fines for trash cans, for the wrong color paint, for a satellite dish that was 2 inches too big. The atmosphere in the room was changing from nervous tension to a low, collective growl of anger. The isolated victims were realizing they were not alone. They were a majority. Karen's face was a mask of fury. "This is out of order. This is a hearing about his violations, not—" "Oh, we're going to talk about violations, Karen." David Chen cut in smoothly. He walked to the front of the room and placed a small projector on the table, aiming it at the blank wall behind the board. "We're going to talk about financial violations." He clicked a button on a remote, and the USB drive from Arthur Pinter came to life. A spreadsheet filled the wall. It was the HOA's budget. "Ladies and gentlemen of Whispering Pines," David said, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor addressing a jury. "For the last 3 years, your HOA fees have been systematically funneled into a slush fund controlled exclusively by your president. It's called the Beautification Fund." He clicked again. A list of expenses appeared on the wall. Payments to Evergreen Landscaping, a company owned by Karen's brother-in-law, for amounts double the standard rate. Payments for pool chemicals from a supplier that didn't exist, and thousands of dollars in vague consulting fees and contingency withdrawals with no receipts, all personally signed off on by Karen Miller. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could hear a pin drop. The other 2 board members were staring at the screen, their faces ashen. They were implicated. That's a lie. It's fabricated," Karen sputtered, but the desperation in her voice betrayed her. "Is it?" David asked. "These are your own records, provided by your former treasurer, Mr. Pinter, who resigned in protest. They are certified bank statements. This is embezzlement. It is fraud. And it is a felony." The trap was sprung. The kill box was sealed. "I have a motion!" a voice shouted from the back. It was Mr. Martinez, his voice now strong and full of conviction. "I move for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of Karen Miller and the entire current board of directors for gross misconduct and financial malfeasance." "Seconded," yelled Mrs. Gable, her voice ringing with newfound strength. Karen was on her feet, screaming. "You can't do that. It's against the bylaws. I am the president." "Actually, you can," David Chen said calmly, holding up the printed copy of the CC and RS. "According to Section 3.4 of your own bylaws, a motion for removal of the board can be brought from the floor at any special meeting, provided a quorum of residents is present. This room is well over quorum. All it requires is a 2/3 majority vote. The coup de grace, using her own rulebook against her. "All in favor of the motion to remove the board," Mr. Martinez yelled. The response was a deafening roar. A forest of hands shot into the air. It was nearly unanimous. "All opposed?" Silence. Only Karen Miller, standing alone at the front of the room, her hand not raised, her face a grotesque mixture of shock and rage. She had been publicly stripped of her power. Her reign was over. With a final, choked sob of fury, she grabbed her purse and shoved her way through the crowd, which parted for her as if she were a leper. She fled the clubhouse into the night. The battle was won. In the immediate aftermath of Karen's spectacular implosion, the community didn't descend into chaos. It did the opposite. A profound sense of relief and liberation filled the clubhouse. Mr. Martinez, emboldened by the victory, nominated Mrs. Gable to act as the interim president. She accepted, flustered but resolute, to a round of thunderous applause. An interim board was formed on the spot, composed of the very people Karen had most relentlessly targeted. They were honest, decent people who had been cowed into silence and were now stepping up to reclaim their community. The new board's first official act, proposed by Mrs. Gable herself, was a unanimous vote to void every fine levied by Karen's board over the past 2 years. Their second act was to issue a formal public apology to me and to pay David Chen's legal fees out of the association's reserve funds. Their third act was to turn over the contents of Arthur Pinter's USB drive to the local police department. The wheels of actual justice began to turn. Within a month, Karen Miller was charged with felony embezzlement. Her brother-in-law's landscaping company was investigated for fraud. The two other board members, in exchange for their testimony against her, were allowed to resign in disgrace. To cover her legal fees and the restitution ordered by the court, Karen was forced to sell her house, the one from which she had surveyed her petty kingdom, and move out of the neighborhood she had terrorized. Her vaguely fascistic pine tree logo disappeared from the entrance sign. The atmosphere in Whispering Pines transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of neighborly cooperation. People started talking to each other again. The Martinez's basketball hoop stayed up. Mrs. Gable's garden gnome was joined by a whole family of them. The oppressive aesthetic conformity gave way to a more relaxed, human environment. The most symbolic change, however, involved the water. At the first official meeting of the new board, I was invited as a guest of honor. Mrs. Gable, in her capacity as president, presented me with a new water easement agreement. It was almost identical to the old one, but it raised the annual fee from the nominal $500 to an amount that more accurately reflected the value of the water, saving the community thousands per year compared to tapping into the municipal line. It was a fair deal, freely entered into by neighbors. But then I proposed a change of my own. I told them that while the valve and the meter would remain on my property, I would build a secure fence around it and give the new board a key. "Good fences make good neighbors," I said, quoting the old poem, "but so does a shared well." It was a gesture of trust, a formal end to the hostilities. The community began to heal. The following spring, they held a neighborhood barbecue on the green space by the clubhouse. I was invited, and I came. I brought a large dish of deviled eggs, made from the very chickens that had started the entire war. People who had once looked at me as a hostile outsider now shook my hand and thanked me. I was no longer the enemy at the gates. I was the liberator. That evening, I sat on my back porch, just as I had on the morning the campaign began. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The chickens were clucking softly in their coop, safe and secure. The sounds from the neighborhood behind me were not of whining electric motors or shrill, angry voices, but of children laughing and the distant murmur of pleasant conversation. The black binder, Operation Clucking Thunder, sat on the table beside me. Its mission was complete. It was full of letters, maps, legal documents, and financial records. The paper trail of a petty tyranny's rise and fall. It was a field manual for a war I never wanted to fight, but was proud to have won. I picked up the binder, walked over to the stone fire pit in my yard, and placed it on the kindling. I struck a match and tossed it in. The pages curled, blackened, and then caught fire, the angry words and false authority turning to smoke and ash, rising into the twilight sky. I had retired from the military seeking peace. For a time, that peace was threatened by a small person with a great and hungry ego. But I had learned long ago that peace is not a passive state. It is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. Sometimes, to have peace, you must be willing to go to war. And as the last of the binder turned to glowing embers, I felt a profound sense of it settle over the farm, over the valley, over me, a quiet, deep, and hard-won peace. The campaign was over. I was finally home.